All right, welcome to another week in the studies of the Gospel of Mark. We're going to look at the last part of Mark chapter 14. That's verses 27 all the way through to verses 72. There's a lot to cover in this chapter. As we get closer to Jesus' death and resurrection, we'll notice that much of the content is covered in all four of the Gospels. The first part or pericope we're going to look at, and all of these are connected together, but it's Jesus predicting Peter's denial. It is closely paralleled in Matthew. It's mentioned in Luke and John as well, actually. Um, Jesus continues with the disturbing news after he's announced that one of them would betray him. He now says that they will all fall away. And when Peter denies this, Jesus restates it in the strongest terms. Uh, in fact, he says, before the rooster crows twice, you will deny me three times. That could be early in the morning, as early as 3 o'clock, as late as kind of dawn. So basically, Jesus is saying, before tomorrow morning, you will betray me three times. Mark's the only gospel to mention that the rooster crows twice. Not a major difference, but just shows that it was a detail that Mark kept in. And the other disciples all agree with Peter, and they say they won't deny their Lord. So we move from that, and if you remember from last week's lesson, we were heading to the Mount of Olives, the Garden of Gethsemane. Gethsemane, by the way, means press, olive press, and so it was likely that there was a grove of olive trees there. All of the synoptics mention this prayer, and that that Jesus takes Peter, James, and John aside with him to pray. He tells them to keep watch and then goes on just a little further alone. And he also tells them that he is overwhelmed with sorrow. In fact, he says to the point of death. And so Jesus is deeply distraught at this time. It's likely much more than the understanding that he's going to die, but the burden of carrying the sin of the world on his shoulders, the reality of being forsaken by the Father. These things all are adding immensely to the burden that he's carrying. And he wants the disciples to be with him for support. He wants them to keep watch. But when Jesus returns the first time, he finds that they have fallen asleep, and he warns them. He's already warned Peter that, you're going to deny me. And then rather than being alert and diligent in prayer, they're actually falling asleep. And so when Jesus returns the first time, he says to them, the spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. Watch out that you don't fall into temptation. The second return, the disciples again have fallen asleep, and they don't know what to say to Jesus. And the third time, they still can't keep awake. And Jesus says, enough. Now the betrayer comes. So the next section, of course, is found in verses 43 to 50, and it's Jesus being arrested right after the time of prayer. And while Jesus just finished talking to the disciples, he sees Judas, and he shows up with a crowd. He had told them in advance that Jesus is the one that he would kiss. And this is really emphasized in Mark, as it has him not only saying that, but then he kisses him and calls him rabbi, a term of respect and endearment. And so to contrast Judas's heart with his words that he's coming to betray his master, and yet he kisses him, and this is the sign of betrayal. uh, profound, uh, profoundly sad moment in this drama. So Peter now realizes what's happening, and he is ready to fight. He said he's going to stand with Jesus, and he fully intends to. And this is not mentioned in Mark that it's Peter, but we know it from the Gospel of John, and that the high priest's name is Malchus. Again, another detail from the Gospel of John. And from Luke, we know that even though Peter struck the high priest's servant's ear and cut it off or severely damaged it, that Jesus heals the man's ear. And then he really takes command of the situation. This is seen very clearly in John, where the people actually fall back when he declares who he is. But in the Synoptics, he diffuses the situation by challenging their motives. You could have arrested me anytime. I was in the temple every day. Why did you come under the cover of darkness? And of course, that's obvious. They were afraid of the people, and they were doing something that wasn't really legal. And so they wanted to do it under the cover of darkness. And at that point, everyone deserts him. The disciples desert him. And we hear about one man who loses his cloak and actually runs away naked. This is a little bit comical, but it's also probably the one point in the gospel where Mark inserts himself. He was likely a young man at the time. We know the early church met in his mother's house, and that most commentators believe that this shows that Mark was present at this point. Next, we go on to the trial before the Sanhedrin, and this is found in Mark 14, 53 to 65. They take Jesus to the high priest. We know from John and Matthew's gospel, as well as history, that the high priest at the time of Jesus' execution was Caiaphas. In John, actually, it mentions a brief time, and there's actually more detail given about the high priest's father-in-law, Anna, who was not the official high priest, but many people believe that he was the man in charge, that Caiaphas was his son-in-law, and so he still ruled behind the scenes. Anyway, at this point, the Sanhedrin is present. That's the chief priests, the elders, and the experts in the law. They together formed the Sanhedrin. If all of them were present, I believe there were about 70, but a quorum was in the range of 20 or 25. They were conspiring together to find witnesses to convict Jesus, and they finally had some that said he claimed he would destroy the temple and raise it up again in 3 days. But even these witnesses, and they, remember, were false witnesses, just brought together for the purpose of trying to get Jesus convicted. They couldn't come to any kind of agreement. And during all this time, Jesus remained silent until he was asked if he was a Christ. And Jesus answered, I am. The high priest decides that this is blasphemy and turns and asks the rest of the Sanhedrin, and they agree, which is the first step in determining Jesus' fate. In all the Gospels, the next section is very important, and it's Peter disowning Jesus. And that's found in Mark chapter 14, 66 to 72. There's slight differences in who confronts Peter, but all agree that the first one to claim that Peter knew Jesus was a mere servant girl. And the second time, Mark has the same girl confronting Peter, and the other Gospels have some different people doing that. And then the third time, it's concerning him being a Galilean with his accent. And of course, Jesus was known to have come from Galilee, and so the assumption was he was guilty by association. And this time he calls down curses on himself, saying that he did not know Jesus. And at that very moment, the the rooster crows the second time, and Peter remembers the words of Jesus, that you will betray me 3 times. This is likely, by the way, uh, the same time that the trial is going on. And we know from the Gospel of Luke that Jesus turns and looks right into Peter's eyes at this moment. And so Peter leaves and weeps bitterly. And again, I would say that it's probably true that while his enemies are demanding that he prophesy, it's right at this time that one of Jesus' words is prophetically fulfilled. And so there's a lot of irony here between the truth of the situation and how the enemies of God are twisting it and misunderstanding who Jesus is, and in some ways understanding who he is. And so, yeah, this is the next part of Mark chapter 14. Again, when we're preaching these passages, we need to remember that this is God's story, and we don't want to get caught up too much in the details and the differences that are in the varying accounts, but to really focus on the drama of the situation and what God is doing, both in allowing this drama to unfold, but also how he is using even man's sinfulness to bring about his purpose in all of this. And so, yeah, that's Mark chapter 14, the second part. We'll see you next week.